Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Green Dragon Podcast. I am your host, Aiden.
And your fellow host, Tom.
Your fellow host, Jake.
We're back this week for part two of the Abraham Lincoln Podcast. We ended last week with South Carolina seceding from the Union, the first state to secede from the Union, which kind of kicked off the Civil War. Last week, if you haven't listened to it, we talked about Abraham Lincoln, his early life, his early political career. We talked about Abraham Lincoln, the lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, the wrestler, Abraham Lincoln, the world's best fence, post driver. What was that, Tom? Was it best fence maker in Indiana?
I think that's right. Yeah.
We talked shit about Illinois. And Indiana. So if you hate either of those states, it's worth a listen. But today we're gonna continue the Abraham Lincoln story, and we'll be talking about Abraham Lincoln as president. We'll be talking about his presidency, the Civil War, and then his death and kind of his legacy. So looking forward to this one. I think it'll be another interesting podcast. I enjoyed last week's podcast a lot. So it's always good when you get to do kind of like a whole deep dive on a single person. I find it enjoyable, especially somebody like Abraham Lincoln, because you learn different things. You hear that, you always hear the same things in the history books and it gets kind of repetitive. But when you do these deep dives, you start to uncover a little bit more about their person.
Yeah, definitely. I guess my initial thought, I'll be honest, I wasn't sure how interesting his early life would be, just because I didn't know too much about it, and therefore assumed that there wasn't much to delve into there. But yeah, no, I was pleasantly surprised with how much there was to dig into there in the first podcast. So super excited for this one to continue the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't know, you just like you start to I think a lot of times when you read about a person in the history books, it's easy to just kind of get this this single-sided idea or picture of who that person was. But then when you do the deep dive on their early life, you start to, especially Abraham Lincoln, at least, because he's known for kind of his later years in life. You start to kind of paint this picture of who this person was and how that influenced him. So it's always really neat to kind of see the foundations of how a person's personality and all that was developed.
Yeah, that was, I don't know if we touched on it last podcast, but I know that kind of a recurring theme in his life was his battle with depression. And
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like he wasn't, I don't know, wasn't really a happy guy exactly. So that was something I didn't know about him. But again, one of those things that you pick up on when you take a little closer look at his personal life.
Yeah, no, I thought that was interesting too, because again, you just don't hear about that. It's yeah, it's interesting I think it's easy to see somebody that was as successful as he was as president and just say, oh, he was just this gung ho type guy, especially the person that's responsible for keeping the United States together, for ending slavery, all these things. Like you kind of just think, I mean, he just a pretty solid guy, a tough guy. I mean, but he was pretty. I mean, he had his tough. He had his moments where he was tough, but he also, I think, yeah, like you said, he struggled a lot with just depression and happiness a lot. I think he kind of just struggled with where he was going
I
a
think he
lot of
had
times.
a couple children die young
Hmm.
too, if I remember right. So that probably
Yeah,
contributed.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I think he just dealt with a lot of loss in his life, and I wonder if that played a role because he lost his actual biological mother very young. We talked a little bit about that in the last podcast, and his stepmom became a very important figure in his life. And he lost some of his siblings then to early childhood death. I mean, it was pretty common back then for if there was a health complication in a younger person under the age of like really 20, your chances of survival were pretty low. So I think he lost a few siblings actually, and then like you said, yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit, but yeah, he lost early in his presidency his son Willie, and I think just kind of that I think there was a lot of loss that followed him in life, and I think that weighed on him heavily. I think a lot of things. I think he was one of those people, maybe that I don't know what you guys think about this, but it seemed like a lot of the issues that he stood up for, like slavery too. I think those things. I don't like it weighed heavily on his conscience. The war weighed heavily on his conscience. Um, the deaths that were involved in the war, I think, weighed heavily on his conscience. So I think I think he held on to a lot of that, a lot of the pains of other people. I don't know what the word for that is. I know there's a word for that, or that type of personality.
Like he like sympathized,
Yeah.
empathized with also from he also had an abusive father as well,
Hmm.
so that especially I think caused him to have some more sympathy for the slaves' plight as well.
Yeah, that's it. I think early on he developed this deep sense of empathy for people, and that's why he got into law because he wanted to make a difference there. But I think throughout his life you kind of see this repetitive pattern of him dealing with a lot of really tough things, and really kind of putting that burden onto his shoulders, which I think weighed on him heavily, and sometimes to his mental, the detriment of his mental health too. But yeah, it's all really interesting um, to see how that shapes a person, especially somebody as influential as he was. After South Carolina seceded from the Union in December of 1860, Lincoln in 1861, now that he's been elected president, he departs from Springfield, Illinois, where he was living at the time with his family, and they make their way to D.C. for his inauguration. And they took that trip from Springfield to D.C. Originally, he was actually supposed to go to Baltimore by train, and it was about a 16-day trip. And during those 16 days, like a lot happened. There was, I mean, we're talking early on. I mean, he's headed to DC for his inauguration, and already the the South is, or kind of the pro-slavery groups are planning his demise from day one. They actually planned a possible, they planned an assassination attempt, and they actually had to divert his travel plans from going into Baltimore, Maryland, and actually they diverted to go secretly into DC. So right off the bat, like you've got this. I mean, I guess I didn't realize that, like how immediate the opposition to Lincoln really started to try to take action against him in like a very violent way. Um, and I think like I don't know. I just thought that was kind of crazy. Um, there's actually a book, and I started to read it, and it's pretty interesting. It's a book on Abraham Lincoln and those and kind of everything that was going on during those 16 days, everything Lincoln was thinking about as he was on this train. I mean, you got to imagine you're on a train for 16 days. You have a lot of time to think. You're, you just had a state secede from the Union. You've got this, looming impending civil war. in the back of your mind. You've got all this turmoil, and then on top of it, your train gets diverted, your travel plans get diverted because the states or the people that don't like you are trying to kill you. Like, I mean, I can't imagine, and I'm really excited to finish this book, to kind of get a full grasp of like what that time looked like. I mean, it's a little over 2 weeks. It's mind blowing that much was happening in those 2 weeks. So, yeah, I'll give you guys an update once I've completed that. Maybe we'll have to do like a follow up podcast just on that. But it's really, really interesting. So he makes it to DC, right? He avoids the assassination attempt, and then he's inaugurated president on the 16th, or he's inaugurated the 16th president on March 4th. So he makes it. He's president now, and then like literally like a little over a month later, on April 12th, the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter, and we talked about that in the Civil War podcast. But like, he's not even like freshly in, like he's a little over a month, and he's already got a federal fort being attacked by the southern states. He's got one state that seceded before that. Now he's got a bunch of other states seceding from the. I mean, it's just a nightmare right out of the gates. That's what, like, you look at like how quickly these events unfolded, and you're just like, wow. Like, the fact that he was able to like have one of the most impactful presidencies out of all the presidents we've had is pretty incredible. And I think it shows like the testament of his like will and strength to follow through with what he set out to do.
Yeah, it's difficult enough to inherit the leadership of a country that's stable, but talk about a trial by fire. I mean, he walks in basically month one. He's inherited a country that's falling apart. And I think it's worth remembering too that like this was his first leadership position. He'd never served as a, like, he wasn't, am I thinking about that right? I know they mentioned in the last podcast that he wasn't like he went right from serving as a lawyer, right, to being president.
I mean, yeah, essentially. I mean, he was elected as a Whig candidate for like the
Okay.
county,
Okay.
into the lower house of Illinois, which was like the General Assembly of Illinois. And then he went back to, he served in the House of Representatives from 44 to 49, 1844 to
Okay.
1849. But still, like, I mean,
So yeah, it wasn't.
House of
Yeah.
Representatives. I mean, he wasn't in DC.
Yeah, it's not the responsibility of like having a people behind your back,
Yes.
whereas say a governor or even a senator to some extent. So
Mhm. And
yeah.
then
Yeah.
after 49, he took. I mean, it wasn't until 1860 that he really got back into politics. Then he served. He went back to his law career after that. So it wasn't like he was a career politician by any means. He was kind of in law, got into the House. He represented Illinois in the House of Representatives, and then it was kind of back to law for him. So
yeah, so this really was new territory for him.
yeah, I mean, talk about just trial by fire. I mean, he just thrown right into it. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. Also, I should mention, guys, one of the reasons, and I had a note and I didn't touch on this in our Civil War podcast. We had talked about how Baltimore was actually like a slave owned, like you could own slaves in Baltimore, and that's one of the reasons they had to divert him to DC instead of Baltimore, because there was a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Baltimore. I don't know if you guys remember that, but they had to basically, when Lincoln became president after they bombed Fort Sumter, he basically was like, aim the cannons. He's like, basically threaten the people of Baltimore to stay in the Union, because he was worried they were going to join the South's resistance too. So that's one of the reasons, why Baltimore was they moved him away from Baltimore on his trip into to be inaugurated because there was such a strong, heavy presence of Confederate sympathizers and pro-slavery people in Maryland and Baltimore at the time. And I think a lot of that had to do with a lot of during the slave trade, a lot of the slaves had arrived on ships into the port of Baltimore, so it just kind of became a hub, so to speak. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there because I had seen the note. And then if you're interested in the book, it's called Lincoln on the Verge. So it says 13 Days to Washington. It's by Ted Wilmer. I'll put the link in the description. So check it out if you're interested. But anyways, so yeah, thrown right into this, you've got the bombing of Fort Sumter. You know, obviously they had to turn the fort over to the Confederates. That was like the official start of the Civil War. And then, you know, right after it, I mean, he got to work. That was April 12th. April 15th, he issued a proclamation basically calling for 75,000 volunteers. And then April 19th, he sent out his proclamation of blockading the ports in several southern states to kind of shut down the trade, to kind of shut down the rebellion. And like we had talked about in the Civil War podcast, the goal, I mean, from the start, I mean, they were like, this is going to be a 3-month war, 90-day war. You know, we'll get this out of, you know, we'll get the fighting out of their systems, and we'll just go back to normal life. They really thought it was going to be over in 90 days. Turned out that wasn't the case. And we talk a little bit about that and why effectively the North didn't shut down the rebellion, and that was mostly due to the leadership of the Army. And you can learn about that more in our Civil War podcast, 3-part series. We went kind of really in depth in there, but it really should have been shut down in 90 days, but it wasn't. So that kind of your first 2 months as president, that will really set the tone. And so, yeah, I mean, after that, it was, you know, really, you got neck deep into the Civil War. You've got, I mean, some major dates to just kind of throw out there. If you're looking at a timeline, so like you said, April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter. Then July 21st, the first Battle of Manassas was fought in Manassas, Virginia. The first Battle of Bull Run. And that was kind of the point, I think, where Lincoln and the Union realized that, oh, like, this isn't just going to be over in 90 days. This is going to be a conflict that really will be drawn out for at least a year. And there wasn't really a sight or end in sight, so to speak, after that. And I think that's when you see a shift in, I think, the way Lincoln approached the war. I think originally it was just kind of, let's shut this down, let's block off. And then after that, it was whatever needs to be done to keep the Union intact needs to be done. I think you kind of saw that shift in his mentality. Not to say that wasn't there from the start, because there was a lot of people that are just like, let the southern states do what they want to do, kind of that status quo thing. But I think you saw Lincoln get really, really serious about ending the conflict and keeping the Union together after that first Battle of Manassas and the amount of lives that were lost. I think the true, what's the word? The true gravity of the situation really had sunk in at that point.
I thought it was interesting too how his relationship with the Union Army generals developed as well. And yeah, I think we mentioned in our Civil War podcast that the Union, they had some characters for for their leadership initially in the Army, not all of a good nature. Some of them, in fact, seemed like they were pretty disrespectful towards Lincoln and didn't really think much of him. There's one story about General McClellan who actually snubbed Lincoln one time at his own house. Lincoln paid him a visit. Was waiting in his parlor, and he ended up walking through another room and going upstairs, going to sleep. So just totally avoiding him. And Lincoln, to his credit, showed a pretty great deal of patience. He even managed to joke about it, said something like as long as he keeps winning battles, then he can ignore me all he wants. So yeah, definitely kept a sense of humor about it, and I think it's a testament to the people skills that he had developed along the way and was able to maintain throughout or maintain some difficult relationships throughout the war too.
Yeah, I think that the relationship he had with a lot of his leaders was shaky at best. I mean, the kind of the there was two, there was the North and the South, and they had very opposite. One had very good leadership, and the other had very poor leadership at the beginning of the war. And the North was on the poor leadership end, and McClellan was the prime example that he actually was he wanted to actually run against Lincoln, and he actually, after he was relieved of his post as general of the Union Army, he actually went and then did run against Lincoln in 1864. So he wasn't exactly like a really stand-up general, that's for sure. But I think it's interesting. One of the things I found fascinating is, you think of Lincoln, you think of he's kind of regarded as like this great. I mean, he's regarded as a great leader of the Union of the United States. So you just kind of automatically assume everybody liked him, especially in the North. But that really wasn't the case. A lot of people disagreed with him, or didn't really care for him, and that just kind of shocks me. Like you think about the guy that's leading your country in a civil war, and there's people in the North that don't really like the guy. They could care less about and I think a lot of people wanted I think it goes back to the status quo thing. A lot of people just wanted status quo, and he wasn't giving them status. Like, he was fighting for something greater, and they didn't understand it. And I think that just rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and they didn't like that. They just wanted to they were kind of selfish. They wanted to go back to their own lives, and he said, no, we're gonna fight this out and keep the Union together. I just thought that was interesting, because you just kind of think of him as like this beloved leader of the North, and that wasn't the case.
Well, I have this really cool book, guys. I got this in school. If you can see that. It's the writings of Lincoln. And I just was looking through my notes here, and I came across this one that I thought you guys would appreciate, kind of to show like where his thoughts were on slavery and like the Union. And one of them was saying that, quote, they're thinking it's right. They're thinking about slavery, the South, and are thinking it wrong is a precise fact upon which depends the whole controversy. Thinking it right as they do, they're not to blame for desiring its full recognition, but as being right. But thinking it wrong as we do, can we yield it to them? Can we cast our votes with their view and against our own? In view of our moral, social, and political responsibilities, can we do this? So he was very, I think, thoughtful in his reasoning for choosing to keep the Union together. Like, there's that part in the podcast we listened to prep for this. I think it was a Civil War history podcast. And you guys remember that part where people were asking him about the Union staying together? It's like when he started to set out to Washington. And he was like, well, we can't just let it fall apart. there's so much more at stake here than just them not wanting to be a part of the Union.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think I have a lot of respect for how deeply he thought about everything. I think he thought much more deeply about things than any other person that I have seen in the Civil War. I think he thought about it more deeply than Jefferson Davis. I think he understood things a lot more deeply than Robert Lee. And so I think he had in his mind a whole, almost like I don't know what you call that, like full map out of what exactly he saw that needed to be or stay the same in America and what needed to improve. And I think that he really understood that when you try to separate the country like that quickly without a good plan in place, things are just going to go really, really south. Oh, oops, there's a pun there. But like, just how he understood that you couldn't really keep America if you wanted to have slaves. That was a breaking point. And then you can't really have two Americas because then you would have them based on different constitutions, and the South hadn't planned out anything. It sounded like they're just like, nope, we're done. And then they don't have a form of government. They don't have what they stand for. They don't have like what their future is going to look like. Like at least with in the Declaration, the founding fathers were thinking about this for a long time before the Declaration. They're like, yeah, this has been like 15 years. We've been thinking about this. We have some plans, ideas, what we like, what we don't like, and then we'll put that in place. It just seems like the South was just like having a bad day and they're like, yeah, we're done with this, you know?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting you pointed out, Tom, that how deeply Lincoln thought about this. And he really, I think, took into consideration everything. And people just kind of think of, oh, he was, opposed, opposed to slavery. And so that's why he really felt the need to, defeat the South and free the slaves. But I think while that might be true to some extent, I think he understood the bigger picture. He understood that a nation divided would be weak. He understood the foresight of the founding fathers and what they believed in, and knew that that had to be fought for. The Union had to be preserved because there was so much more that the country yet had to yet experience. It's still a very young country um, at that point, and it needed to stay together to preserve that strength, so it could kind of see out the full potential of what our founders really intended. Um, and so to have that foresight and to have that just very deep thoughtfulness towards that as a especially a leader that just started from, I mean, like from day one. Lincoln had that thoughtfulness. I think that's maybe something he already had in his mind coming into his presidency. Is this idea of keeping the nation together so it could become something great and making the nation even better than it was. And I think that's really kind of the legacy he left behind. Is even though he left behind a war-torn nation after his death, I think he left behind this legacy of freedom for all, and that's something that improved upon what the founding fathers did. And I think he left in that way. He left the nation better. He kind of accomplished what he set out to do, which was to improve the nation.
I actually have a really cool quote to like reinforce your point there, Aiden. If you guys mind me sharing that?
Absolutely, yeah.
So this is a speech at Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm not sure what Oh yeah, it's February 22nd, 1861. So he said, I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I have often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and adopted the Declaration of Independence. I have pondered over the toils that were endured by the officers and soldiers of the army to achieve that independence. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but something in that declaration giving liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weight should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and all should have an equal chance. This is the sentiment embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Now, my friends, can this country be saved upon that basis? If it can, I will consider myself one of the happiest men in the world if I can help save it. If it can't be saved upon that principle, it will be truly awful. But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated at this spot than to surrender.
Wow. That's pretty. I mean, that sums up. I think really what Lincoln's legacy. I mean, really is, and it's really cool that like, what did you say that was? 1861 February.
Yeah, the 22nd.
The 22nd of February. Okay, so I mean that's literally as he arrives to to DC.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because I mean yeah. So I mean he got on the train and he was inaugurated on March 4th of '61. So it's within that time period. So that's like day one Lincoln, and he's putting that out there. And so I understand why it rubbed a lot of the people that didn't like or were pro-slavery in the wrong way. And I think to have that like strength as a leader to come out and just, I think that's something that's missing in today's political leaders is you day one say you're going to do something and then you see it through. And that's, I think, really cool. And to see it through in the way he did, he took it, he didn't back down even when it came to war. I mean, his he knew in his heart that this was right and it was what was best for the country, and it resulted in a civil war. It resulted in his assassination, and yet that legacy kind of still lives on, which is pretty amazing.
Really, really had a way with words too, didn't he? I mean, Tom, listening to those quotes that you read from, you can appreciate that he had a very captivating manner of speech, I think, even by the standards back then, which were very good. I think he was one of those guys that when he talked, people listen.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just basing it off, his list of different proclamations and speeches he gave during his presidency that are like in the archives and held in regard to some of the greatest documents of our country's history. I mean, it's impressive. It's really impressive.
I think that harkens back to his habits as a young person when he would just read all the time and then think while he worked all day. So it seemed like he was the kind of guy that thought very deeply about everything that interested him. He wanted to make sure that he understood it and then could articulate it, and then to show people his point of view in hopes that they all come to the truth, which I think is definitely a mark of I think, an honorable leader. Like, I have heard um, people say that Lincoln wasn't very good. At least from what I've studied here in the podcast, I feel like he's doing a lot to credit to be given to him. I mean, all the stuff he had to deal with, the level of stuff he had to deal with. I mean, he was, like we said earlier, like a lot of people didn't like him. People weren't on his side. They thought he was a little bit going overboard and trying to keep the Union together. But I mean, I feel like this is kind of a common thing now, that the good people are usually hit the hardest. And so when someone's hit really hard, then you know they're probably really good. So I don't know what your guys' take on that is.
I think you're totally right. I was thinking about this today, actually, because I was thinking about a lot of the things that are going on currently. I was thinking to myself, you know, the people that their message resonates with me the most and seem to be the truth, like seem to be the closest to the truth, right? Are always the people that are attacked from both sides of the political aisle. You look at people like, you know, not to bring in current news too much, but like you look at people like Tucker Carlson or even Trump too. I mean, these are people that both sides of the aisle, they don't really like them. They're kind of this misfit. They don't really fall into the category of you know, the Republican or Democrat. You know, they don't fall under those labels. They kind of sit somewhere in between, and they have a lot of really amazing ideas. They're just they make the people that are corrupt uncomfortable. And I think the same thing as Lincoln. I think he made a lot of people uncomfortable because he was pushing the envelope with his ideas in a good way. And I think too, the other thing that I think, actually, we mentioned this last podcast, but I was listening to the Lex. There was a clip from a Lex Friedman show, and he was talking to this guy about how Lincoln was the best leader in, you know, one of the best leaders in world history, not only American history, and that's because of his ability. And I think this applies in this situation. But he had this idea, he had this dream of what America could be, and he shared that vision from day one. He shared that vision with the American people, and his goal as president was not to force that upon the American people, but help the American people fall in love with that vision. And that's like the true sign of a good leader. Not that it's mandated, or not that their vision for what the country can be should be forced upon the people, mandated upon the people, but that it should be expressed in a way by that leader for the people then to come to appreciate that viewpoint, to if they find it to be true. So it's a leader that helps the people discover the truth. I think that's something that's really cool, and I think that's what made Lincoln one of the greats. And I think that's what makes great leaders today too. And usually those people are persecuted because the people that are typically in power typically don't want the general population to discover the truth. They want to control the truth. And so it's this game of the people that want to control what truth is and the people that want to help everybody else discover what truth is. So
Yeah, I have one more quote to give you guys. This is from the second inaugural address. This is the last paragraph from it. But I think it also tells, it strengthens your position, Aiden. So this is on March 4th, 1865. And he says, quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which we may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." End quote.
That's pretty awesome. Again, like just wow, like what an amazing like writer, speaker, orator, all the above. To be able to not only have those thoughts but convey those thoughts in a very like artistic, beautiful manner is just, I mean, it's an incredible gift. And he did it over and over and over again.
Yeah, like I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Lincoln from Steven Spielberg.
Yes,
You have?
it's good. It's really good.
You seen that one, Jake?
Yeah, yeah, that's probably up there. One of my top 10 or 15, I would say,
It's
historical movies.
Daniel Day-Lewis plays Lincoln, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and he's always good.
Yeah. Yeah, if you guys haven't, if you listeners haven't watched that, highly recommend. I think it's on. Is it on HBO or Netflix? It's on one of the two. I know it's on one of the streaming platforms. It's out there. You can find it. But
Yeah,
no, that.
I was
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I was just thinking that movie was, I think they did a good job of showing a bit of his eloquence in speech.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it seemed like every time he said something, you were like, "Whoa, I have to think about that. That was really deep." Like, when he's just talking to somebody, or like when he's playing with his kids or something like that. You can tell that even while he's playing with his son, that he's still thinking about all these things. And like,
Yeah, there's so many.
but I think yeah, please say it.
Sorry, Tim. I was just gonna say there's so many historical movies that that just ruin the persona of the figures that they're trying to portray, but that definitely was not one of them. I thought that was pretty accurate as well.
Yeah, like you you had a great respect for him, even though he's complicated. Like you're not really sure all the time what he's actually thinking. I think that's another good point. Is like if you have somebody who's really easy to read all the time, then you kind of know the next move. But with Lincoln, you were like, wow, like he really knows what's right. It seems like he wants to know what's right and he's going for it. And then people were a little surprised at how strong he could make his position. I think that was shown in the Emancipation Proclamation. Like, people are like, well, can you actually bribe the Democrats to do this? And it's like, well, if they'll accept the bribe. So,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, it's like, well, is that wrong or is that okay? I don't know.
Yeah, it kind of toes the line, makes you think a little bit.
Yeah, because it's like they would do it if you gave them a push.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like they're actually thinking on their own. They're just kind of going wherever you tell them to go. So yeah, a lot of stuff here to think about. But I'm sorry, guys. I feel like I kind of took us down a rabbit hole. But
No, rabbit holes.
No, that was
Rabbit holes are good, Tom.
that was
Especially,
all great content.
okay.
yeah.
I thought I just love reading his thoughts on paper because then it allows you to kind of enter into his mind and see what's coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. When trying to learn more about it, who better than the man himself?
Exactly. Yeah. It helps you. Yeah. It kind of puts you in his, yeah, like you said, his mind. Gives you it takes you on a little bit of a trip. Speaking of the Emancipation Proclamation, Tom, that's the next kind of key point in his presidency. 1862 was a year of, I feel like, a lot of sorrow for Lincoln. He lost his son early in 1862, Willie. We had mentioned that. So it was a pretty I feel like that year was especially emotional. And then you had a lot of a lot of battles that were being fought that were just taking massive tolls, um, as far as loss of life went. So I mean, not only his, public service as president was there are a lot of really just difficult moments, but there was also difficult moments in his private life. So he really didn't escape from that. Later that year in 1862, September 22nd, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation after the Union won at the Battle of Antietam on September 17th. So that was kind of the first push for the Emancipation Proclamation. And then on January 1st, to start out the new year, 1863, he issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. So at that point in the war, it did seem like the tides were turning, I think, a little bit. And because in, what was it, later that year, 1863 in July, you had the Battle of Gettysburg, and then Vicksburg later. So it was like a series of really big wins for the Union. That year was the turning point in the war. But yeah, you had this massive event in U.S. history. I mean, you really think about the Emancipation Proclamation and what that means, and it solidifies, like we talked about before, and kind of Lincoln's thoughts on this. It solidified what should have been in the Declaration of Independence, and that is that all men are created equal and should have the same rights. And so that's a pretty monumental moment. And I think that moment, if he already wasn't, locked in as one of the greats, that really locked him in as one of the greats historically, because he followed through with something that even the founding fathers knew they should do, but didn't follow through with. You see, we talked about this in some of our other podcasts about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Slavery from the beginning was a contentious issue, and both Washington and Jefferson, I think in their hearts, knew it was wrong and it should be abolished, but weren't willing to take the steps necessary to end it. And their belief was that it would cause a civil war, and guess what? It did. But Lincoln, had the balls, so to speak, to see it through and go to war, keep the Union together, and end slavery. And so that moment, I'm sure for him, was to see through something that he had promised, as you read, Tom, from the very beginning of his presidency. I have to imagine it was an amazing moment for not only the country, but for that sense of accomplishment and kind of that weight lifted off his shoulders, so to speak, to know that he had done everything in his power to complete what he set out to do. So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially that many years after we started it out, like all those battles fought, at least to see some victory happening was probably a huge consolation for him.
Mm-hmm.
And not to mention, it probably was helping at least the southern slaves, at least seeing them as like, oh, we are Americans,
Mm-hmm.
Even though it was a really difficult time for them, at least the North was trying to say, like, we're not trying to stop America from growing. It's just like we're just kind of tired of what the South is doing.
Mm-hmm.
But we still want America, and we still want you guys to be part of America. So I hope that message came through a little bit at least, even though it was a really, really trying time for everyone.
Yeah, I think I don't think it was totally recognized probably until later, that message that he was trying to get through. But I think the lasting effects of the proclamation have brought us in the end closer together as a country, even though there has been turmoil since, obviously. with a lot of the things that have gone on in the last 100 years too. I mean, not to say that this was like a quick fix by any means or any stretch of the imagination. Obviously, we still deal with a lot of the divisions from what slavery did to our country today. But this was, I think, one of the greatest moments because it started the ability for there to be healing in the country. So yeah, if you haven't read the Emancipation Proclamation, I would recommend, we can link something in the show notes too for you guys to go read it, because again, it's just another beautiful piece of writing. And I would highly recommend going and reading that. Shortly thereafter, again, I mean, this was his year for amazing pieces of of writing, because so you had the Battle of Gettysburg, obviously one the bloodiest battle fought on American soil. And so on November 19th, Lincoln goes to the battlefield in Gettysburg and gives the Gettysburg Address. That's probably his most famous piece of, or his famous speech. If you're going to look at Lincoln's speeches, the Gettysburg Address. And I think, again, like, it's just another one of those moments where his ability to convey what he's thinking really comes through. And at least when I read the Gettysburg Address, it makes me realize that, is much as Lincoln was willing to go to all ends to keep the Union together, I think he understood the gravity of what it meant to be at war, and how important it was for the nation, even in the middle of its darkest time as a kind of a split nation, to remember that the American people were one, and that even though at this point we were fighting against each other, we're still all Americans. And so that really came through, I feel like, in the Gettysburg Address. It's a very, I feel like it came from the bottom of Lincoln's heart. If you read the Gettysburg Address, you really feel like the deep sorrow he feels, because he sees a nation divided, brothers killing brothers, and you really feel that in his address. And it's kind of, I feel like, a call to the American people, the North and South, to make amends, make peace, come together, stop fighting. And it didn't happen until later, but I think to have that outlook as a leader, not hold either side, not hold your enemy in, not hold anything against them, and try to unite the American people even in its darkest time, I think is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it really is amazing. I mean, to have that type and level of foresight and stability inside of a situation of that magnitude is very remarkable and honorable. Something that I think you can kind of just feel from Lincoln. You just feel like he's the boss, he knows what's going on, and you should probably listen to what he has to say, even if you don't like him. It seems like he definitely has a lot of well-examined thought that he's sharing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, and then shortly thereafter, he issued the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, which basically gave lenient terms for former Confederates to rejoin the Union if they wanted to, which is pretty cool. So you saw that kind of like that olive branch, so to speak, and him trying to reach out and make peace with the South even before the war had ended, which is pretty amazing. And so, yeah, then moving forward, this is going into the 1864 election. He's nominated presidential candidate for the Republican Party. He was doubtful of his chances for re-election, and he actually wrote a memorandum pledging to work with the president-elect to save the Union. And he requested the cabinet members to sign the sealed document without seeing its contents. That was on August 23rd, 1864. Shortly thereafter, the war started to, as we talked about the Civil War podcast, started to take after the Battle of Gettysburg, you had the Sherman's campaign in Atlanta. Atlanta fell to Sherman September 1st, and on November 8th, the war, by then the war is kind of coming to a close, and Lincoln's actually reelected as president on November 8th, 1864. On Christmas of that year, he received a telegram from Sherman saying that he basically Sherman presented Savannah, Georgia as a Christmas gift to Lincoln, basically saying, if the war was over, it's like Sherman fashion. He's just kind of a tough guy. But yeah, so at this point, the war has almost come to a complete close. I mean, the Southern Army's basically been crushed at this point. And then Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, or in January of 1865, is solidified as the U.S. House of Representatives passed joint resolution to the U.S. Constitution to abolish slavery. So that's the day where it all comes together, and the amendment was sent to the states for ratification and became the 13th Amendment in December. So pretty awesome. Then March 4th of the 1865 was his second inauguration. And then a month later, the war ends, or the war kind of officially comes to a close as Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. So there were some skirmishes, and the Southern Army didn't fully surrender completely, but that's kind of the defining moment when the Civil War's ended. Lincoln has led the Union to victory as commander-in-chief. He's abolished slavery and pretty successful. But that's not the end of the story, obviously, as most of you all know. Kind of leads us into his assassination. So April 9th, obviously, Appomattox Court is the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. April 11th, Lincoln delivers his final public speech. And in my research on this is one of the first times Lincoln expresses his support for African American suffrage. Outside of this, obviously he addressed slavery many times, but the actual, black suffrage, and kind of really advocated for the assimilation of, African Americans back and people of color back into just normal American life. And this was a statement that incited a member of the audience, John Wilkes Booth. And he vowed that, quote, this was the last speech that he will ever make, referring to Lincoln. So obviously it was Lincoln's re-election and his views, even though the country and the South had surrendered, wasn't fully accepted by everybody. And I think John Wilkes Booth is a kind of a representation of that that faction of people in the South. So yeah, leads to 3 days later, Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater in D.C. He's attending a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. He's in the presidential kind of sort of booth suite, whatever you call it. And he's shot point blank with a Philadelphia Derringer by John Wilkes Booth. And dies about 9 hours later on April 15th at 7:22 a.m. So obviously, the nation at this point has lost their leader, the leader that led them through the Civil War, and yeah, I can't imagine what that. I don't know. I can't imagine what that day or two surrounding the Lincoln assassination had to feel like. I mean, you got to think the war's over. There's got to be this great sense of like peace, or not peace, but like relief. I guess relief is the right word. That the war's over, and things can go back to normal. Obviously, there's a lot of people that have lost loved ones in the war, and so I think there's this huge sense of relief that's kind of swept across the nation. And then a few days later, you've got the President of the United States being assassinated. So I wonder what that time was like. I wish I could like go back to feel that like first few hours, that first day, those first few days, what that had to feel like. I mean, can't imagine.
Yeah, and this is before like social media and news broadcasts. So if you're a civilian out in, I don't know, let's say Ohio, you hear that the president's been assassinated. The Secretary of State was also um, experienced an attempted assassination as a coordinated attack with one of John Wilkes Booth's co-conspirators. So I would think you hear those two stories, you're kind of wondering, are we going back into war? Is this going to be a recurring um, like guerrilla type of warfare that they're going to be carrying out? So I think it would have been a nerve-wracking couple of weeks at least for kind of the average citizen, even guys maybe that were returning from the army, kind of wondering if they're gonna like they just realized
back.
like they just escaped, made it through the 4 or 5 years of the war, and now wonder if they're gonna have to go back to the front lines.
Not to mention, you still had actually some some of the Confederate army still fighting in the South.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
the war, obviously the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse kind of marks this definitive. I mean, as we look back on it, it marks this definitive moment in history where the Civil War kind of ended. But you got to realize that not everybody surrendered on that day. So, and it wasn't like they're like, okay, Lee's done. Everybody's done. There were still some armies that I mean, there was battles that were or skirmishes fought for I think several months. So you've got several days after Lee surrenders. It's the country's still in a bit of upheaval, but I think you've got this little sense of as an average citizen, you're like, oh, Lee surrendered. That's the majority of the Confederate army. The war is over, and then all of a sudden this happens. You're like, whoa, what's gonna happen?
And from what I understand, I think that was what Booth's intention was to kind of resurrect the Southern cause and continue the war. Obviously, that didn't pan out the way he hoped, but that was his goal.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit before the podcast too. You hear the name John Wilkes Booth and you just think Lincoln's assassin, but at the time he was a very prominent actor too. Like this wasn't just like some rando assassinating the president. This was like it would be like Ben Affleck or Ryan Reynolds assassinating the president. And so you gotta like imagine too, like I would think like some people are like, whoa, like does this I wonder if I wonder if people thought, does this person represent a large portion of the population? Like, or or just I mean I think about it in today's terms, and I'm like, if a prominent person did something like that, you'd be like, wow, I wonder if there's I mean, if this person has millions of followers and millions of people love this person, does that sort of sentiment that they took action on, or resonate with the people that love them, like, or look to them as a, I don't know, a celebrity, like I wonder if that at all played a factor too, his popularity.
Yeah, going off of that, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the bubble that the celebrities of today live in, because you look at John Wilkes Booth and he thought that like his action would um essentially like spark a second wave of revolution from the South, where most people that actually lived through their farmlands, homes being ravaged, torn down, destroyed during battles, the people that experienced the real brunt of the war
Mm.
were ready to move on at that point.
Yeah.
And I think he lived up north in Washington for the whole course of the war, so he wasn't really in touch with what the people he thought he was representing were really experiencing. So I don't know. I kind of draw the comparison to the celebrities of today that carry out the social justice crusades, thinking that they're representing a cause, but in reality are just showing that they live in a bubble and really are not in touch at all with the reality of the everyday person.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I think one of the things in one of the podcasts I listened to about Lincoln's assassination, they talked about um, John Wilkes Booth, and they were saying how he was basically like he didn't fight at all. So like he he had this cause that he believed in, that he went to the extent of assassinating the president, but he didn't actually fight for it. So he was kind of like a poser, so to speak. He had this cause, but he didn't really. He was too afraid to actually go and fight for it, and it kind of reminds me of, to a certain extent, celebrities nowadays too, where they're willing to post their social media campaigns and all this stuff, but when rubber hits the road, they're not actually willing to stand up for the things they say they believe in. And granted, he went to I mean, in the end, he did go to the extent of assassinating the president, but I think, like, yeah, I don't know. I think in many ways you kind of see that, yeah, just kind of that removed from reality mentality of a celebrity in John Wilkes Booth. So after Lincoln's assassination, funeral was held at the White House on April 19th, 1865. And then a funeral train took his body from D.C. To Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown. And then the funeral train left there and actually took the bodies of him and his son Willie, and returned to Springfield, Illinois. And they stopped along the way in different cities in the Northeast and Midwest. It's kind of a funeral procession, and then he was laid to rest in Springfield, Illinois. His tomb, you can actually go there and see it. I've been there. It's a pretty somber place to go and visit, but it's also pretty interesting. It's one of the few things Illinois got the body. and that's how we stole the term land of Lincoln. So I guess he spent enough years there where we just decided to send him to Springfield. Don't send him to Indiana. But yeah, it's I think I've also been to the Lincoln Memorial in DC, and that's a pretty cool place too. The Lincoln Monument, Lincoln Memorial. What is it called, guys? Why am I blanking on this? Is it the memorial or is it
I
a
think
mine?
it's the memorial,
The
right?
memorial, Lincoln Memorial, right?
Yeah,
The one on the penny. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty cool place. You get to see the big statue of Lincoln sitting on the chair. I mean, that's a pretty powerful place too. But yeah, I mean, the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. When I think about his legacy, I think of several things. I think of the man that preserved the Union at all costs. He stood up for what he believed in and what he set out to do with the abolishment of slavery. He didn't back down. He stuck to his gun, stuck to his words. And also, I think you can't talk about the legacy of Lincoln without talking about his leadership and statesmanship, even in some of the most difficult times in American history. Like we talked about with his efforts to keep a country, even in the midst of civil war, united as much as possible through his words, through his outreach to try to bring people together. I think Lincoln is a symbol of unity. He's a symbol of fighting for everything that is true. I think when I think of defenders of truth, defenders of freedom, Abraham Lincoln comes to mind. Not only in the physical sense of keeping, a country together, but also fighting for the freedom of the American people, the freedom of all Americans to have the same amount of opportunity and equality across the board. And I think that's something that will always live on in the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. You guys have any last thoughts on Lincoln?
I think you said it pretty well, Aiden. I think it is really his determination to keep America united that really shines a light on all the other things he did, because he was very focused on that main mission. And so slavery was to keep, ending slavery was to keep America together. Keeping the South in the Union was to keep America together. He wanted Americans to see each other as a free people. He didn't want us to be in slavery of any kind. And I think he wanted us to see that America is the place for other people to see what freedom looks like, so that they too can choose to have freedom in their place in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we can all, if all of us embody just a little bit of that and live that sort of the Lincoln mentality out in our everyday lives, I think America would be a far better place. So with that, guys,
Sure.
yeah, definitely. Jake, you have anything before we close out?
I guess just one thing I didn't mention that stood out to me about him was just how he never wavered in any of his beliefs. Like everything, every speech that he gives, there's like I don't know, like a continuity to it. And that's again something that you don't really see nowadays, and really any politicians that I could think of, they seem to be all over the place with their statements and beliefs, but he was yeah, stuck to his guns and didn't waver. So that's something that I learned about him through my research on this podcast and have really come to admire.
Yeah, it's hard not to admire that, I think. And yeah, we could all probably use a little bit of that, yeah, in our beliefs too, just to never back down for what we believe in. So yeah, with that, thanks to everyone for tuning into this episode of the Green Dragon podcast. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the show. If you did, you can drop us a like, leave us a comment or review. If you like what you heard and want to give us a follow, go to the Green Dragon podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and True Social. The Green Dragon Pod on Rumble and Twitter. You can listen to the show everywhere you go, on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. So you can listen to us all the time. New podcast every Friday, 6 a.m. EST. That's when they get posted. I'm not up then. I automatically schedule them. But until next time, be safe, fight for what you believe in, and most importantly, be a good American. God bless.